The morning had started like any other in our quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was just beginning to spill its golden light over the manicured lawns, casting long shadows from the neatly trimmed hedges and flowering shrubs that lined our street. Birds chirped from the trees, and the faint hum of sprinklers created a soothing soundtrack. It was a perfect day, or so it seemed. My wife, Emily, was 6 months pregnant. She had been radiant lately, glowing with that unmistakable expectancy, her hands constantly resting on her rounded belly as if to protect the tiny life growing inside her. That morning, she was dressed in a soft, flowing maternity dress, her hair pulled back loosely, and her eyes sparkled with calm contentment. We were preparing to head out for a routine prenatal appointment, a brief drive from our home to the clinic, but first, we had a small task: attaching the new HOA sticker to our mailbox. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, was notorious in our neighborhood for their rigid rules and aggressive enforcement. It wasn't unusual for them to send letters demanding that residents fix even the slightest infraction: a crooked fence, a non-standard mailbox color, or a missing sticker. We had just received our annual HOA sticker in the mail, and though it seemed trivial, we didn't want to risk a fine. Emily had insisted we take care of it immediately. I grabbed the small, adhesive sticker from the kitchen counter, handing it to her as we walked toward the mailbox. The morning air was crisp, the kind that makes the lungs feel alive and awake, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to forget the underlying tension that came with living under the constant gaze of our HOA. As Emily carefully affixed the sticker to the mailbox, I noticed movement at the far end of the street. Mrs. Lorraine Hargrove, our neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, was marching down the sidewalk, her expression as rigid as her posture. She was the type of person who seemed to have made it her life mission to ensure every homeowner complied with every rule, no matter how minor. Neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, often referring to her as HOA Karen. Today, she was coming straight for us, her eyes locked on the mailbox as though it were the center of some personal crusade. Emily stepped back to admire her handiwork, unaware that trouble was approaching. "There," she said softly, brushing her fingers together. "That should do it." She smiled, and I felt a surge of warmth. Moments like this, simple, domestic, ordinary, were what I cherished most, especially now with Emily carrying our first child. But the peace was short-lived. Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut through the morning air like a siren. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Emily and I turned, startled, to see her striding toward us with a sense of purpose that was almost militaristic. Her face was flushed with anger, her lips pressed tightly together, and her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "I'm just putting on the new HOA sticker," Emily said politely, though a hint of caution crept into her tone. She always tried to keep interactions civil, no matter how aggressive the other person might be. "Just putting it on?" Mrs. Hargrove snapped. "Do you even realize that sticker is outdated? You're supposed to remove last year's first. That's a violation of HOA regulations. Don't you care about the rules? Or about setting a good example?" I stepped forward, trying to calm the situation before it escalated. "Mrs. Hargrove, we just got the sticker in the mail. We're following the rules, I promise. There's no harm done." But she wasn't listening. Her eyes were wild, and her voice grew louder with each word. "No harm? This is blatant disrespect. Do you know how much time and effort the HOA board puts into maintaining standards around here? And you?" She pointed directly at Emily. "You think you can just ignore that?" Emily's hands instinctively went to her stomach. "Please," she said softly, though the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "I'm pregnant. I'm just trying to comply with the rules." That seemed to infuriate Mrs. Hargrove further. "Pregnant or not, rules are rules. You can't just..." She stopped mid-sentence, glaring at Emily as if trying to read her thoughts. Her face twisted with anger, and suddenly, without warning, she lunged forward. Time seemed to slow. I reached out instinctively, but she was fast. Her hand made contact with Emily's arm, and then another, harder, shove knocked her backward toward the lawn. Emily stumbled, her foot catching the edge of the mailbox post, and she fell to the ground. A sharp cry escaped her lips, more from shock than pain, and I rushed to her side. "Emily, are you okay?" My voice shook with panic. She was on her hands and knees, her dress slightly torn, her face pale. A thin streak of blood was forming at the corner of her mouth, and she winced in pain. I could feel my own blood boiling. How could someone be so blind to human decency, so consumed by petty regulations, that they would attack a pregnant woman over a sticker? Mrs. Hargrove, on the other hand, seemed almost oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Her eyes were wide with righteous fury. "You can't treat this lightly. This is about accountability, about order, about order? I shouted, unable to hold back any longer. You just attacked a pregnant woman over a piece of paper. The neighbors, roused by the commotion, began to peek out of their windows. Some stepped onto their porches, horrified, while others froze, unsure how to react. Mrs. Hargrove finally seemed to notice the small crowd, and her expression flickered between indignation and fear, though she quickly masked it with defiance. Emily was trembling, her hand still pressed against her stomach, and I helped her to sit upright on the lawn. Her breathing was shallow, and I could see the tears forming in her eyes. I'm fine, she whispered, but I knew better. The fear and shock were as dangerous as the fall itself. I turned to Mrs. Hargrove, anger surging through me, but I also knew that confronting her directly could escalate things further. Instead, I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. I could hear the faint murmurs of our neighbors as they observed the scene, some of them shaking their heads, others whispering about how extreme she had become. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos in our yard. There's been an assault, I said, my voice tight. My wife, she's pregnant, was attacked by our neighbor over an HOA sticker. She's bleeding and in pain. As we waited for the authorities, Emily clung to my arm, trying to steady herself. I held her close, my mind racing. How could something so petty, so insignificant, have turned our quiet, idyllic morning into a scene of fear and violence? I glanced at Mrs. Hargrove, who now stood a few feet away, her chest heaving as if she had just won some moral victory. But all I felt was fury and disbelief. By the time the police arrived, the calm facade of our street had shattered. The sun was higher now, illuminating the small crowd that had gathered. Some neighbors had their phones out, documenting the scene, while others simply watched, horrified. Emily's hand rested on her stomach, her face pale but resolute. She was scared, yes, but also strong, a reminder of why we had to face this ordeal together. The officers quickly assessed the situation, speaking with us and Mrs. Hargrove separately. I could hear her repeating the same phrases about rules, order, and accountability, but her words fell flat against the reality of what she had done. No amount of justification could erase the fact that a pregnant woman had been hurt on her lawn over a missing sticker. As they took statements and snapped photos of the scene, I held Emily close, silently promising her, and our unborn child, that we would not let this incident define us. The morning had started with the promise of peace and routine, and though it had been violently disrupted, we were determined to reclaim it. But even in those first few hours, I knew that the road ahead would be long, filled with legal battles, emotional scars, and the challenge of confronting someone who truly believed she was above basic human decency. And yet, amid the fear, pain, and outrage, one thing was clear: this would not be the end of the story. The events of that morning would echo through our lives, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the dangerous lengths some people would go to in the name of rules and authority. The air had changed in our neighborhood that morning. Where there had been the gentle hum of sprinklers and birdsong, now there was tension, a sharp, electric charge that seemed to ripple through the perfectly manicured lawns. The police had arrived quickly, 2 officers stepping out of their patrol car with calm efficiency. Their presence was reassuring, but it could not erase the shock that still held Emily trembling in my arms. "Sir, ma'am, can you walk me through exactly what happened?" one of the officers asked, his notebook open and pen poised. His voice was professional but tinged with concern. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself for Emily's sake. "We were just putting a new HOA sticker on our mailbox. That's all." Mrs. Hargrove came down the street yelling, and before we knew it, she shoved my wife. "She fell on the lawn and is bleeding, she's pregnant." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. Was this intentional, or accidental? "She pushed her," I said firmly. "It was deliberate. She was angry over a sticker. Over a stupid sticker." Emily's voice was soft, almost fragile. I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to put the sticker on. I thought everything was fine." Her hand instinctively went to her stomach. I squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her silently that she was safe now. The officers exchanged glances and then walked over to Mrs. Hargrove, who was standing stiffly a few feet away. Her face had paled slightly, but she was still holding herself with a rigid, almost defiant posture. "Ma'am, can you tell us your side?" the second officer asked. Mrs. Hargrove straightened her shoulders, her voice sharp. "I was just enforcing the rules. They were violating HOA regulations. It's my duty to make sure people follow the rules. That's all. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. You pushed her, I said flatly, unable to mask the anger in my voice. You knocked a pregnant woman to the ground. Mrs. Hargrove blinked, almost as if the accusation were foreign to her. Well, she was breaking the rules. I felt my jaw tighten. It was infuriating. How could someone rationalize attacking a pregnant woman over a trivial regulation? Emily's trembling hand pressed against my arm, and I realized how fragile this moment was. Even with police intervention, the situation felt volatile, raw, and unresolved. The officers began documenting everything. Photographs of the mailbox, Emily's scraped dress, the streak of blood along her lips. They spoke to neighbors who had gathered on their porches or peeked out their windows. A few whispered to the officers, corroborating our story. Mrs. Hargrove had a reputation for being aggressive, for escalating minor issues into confrontations. Some were hesitant to come forward, fearing retribution, but a few brave souls stepped up quietly, confirming what had happened. Emily, meanwhile, was becoming more visibly upset. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. One officer suggested we take her to the hospital to get checked out, just to be safe. I didn't need to think twice. I scooped her gently into my arms, careful not to jostle her, and followed the officers to the patrol car. The drive to the hospital was silent, punctuated only by Emily's soft sobs. I kept telling her it would be okay, but inside, I was seething. I couldn't believe someone could behave with such reckless disregard, endangering both my wife and our unborn child, and then shrug it off as enforcing rules. At the hospital, the staff quickly ushered Emily into the examination room. A nurse immediately checked her vitals and then carefully monitored the baby's heartbeat. The rhythmic thump of the fetal monitor was both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it reminded me of how fragile life could be, comforting because it confirmed our little one was still safe, for now. Emily leaned back on the hospital bed, exhausted and shaken. I can't believe someone would do this, she murmured. Her eyes filled with tears, and I brushed her hair from her face, trying to offer reassurance. I know, I said softly. I know, but we're going to be okay. We have to be strong, for us and for the baby. After ensuring Emily was stable and that the baby's heartbeat was strong, the hospital staff suggested documenting the injuries for legal purposes. Photographs were taken of the scratches on her arms, the cut on her lip, and the minor abrasions she had sustained from hitting the lawn. The nurse explained that these records could be used as evidence in any legal action we chose to pursue. While Emily rested, I made a series of phone calls. First to a friend who was a lawyer, explaining the situation and asking about our options. Next to the HOA board, filing a formal complaint. And finally, I called my parents, who immediately promised to come over and provide support. The reality of the incident was starting to sink in. This was not just a shocking encounter. It was a violation of safety, decency, and common sense. Back in the neighborhood, the fallout had begun to spread like wildfire. Within hours, the story had become the topic of hushed conversations among neighbors. Some expressed outrage at Mrs. Hargrove's actions, but others seemed to side with her, citing her supposed commitment to rules. Social media posts circulated quickly, with photos of Emily's injuries and the commotion outside our home. People debated endlessly, some offering sympathy and support, others nitpicking about HOA regulations and questioning whether the conflict could have been avoided. It was surreal. The neighborhood I had always considered a safe, orderly place suddenly felt like a pressure cooker, full of judgment, tension, and fear. I found myself both angry and disappointed, not just at Mrs. Hargrove, but at the casual way some neighbors seemed to normalize aggressive behavior under the guise of enforcing rules. The police had promised to follow up with a full report, including witness statements and photographic evidence. They suggested that charges could be filed for assault, but they also warned that HOA disputes often dragged out in courts, becoming messy and prolonged. I felt a cold wave of frustration wash over me. This wasn't just about a sticker. It was about accountability, about ensuring that a pregnant woman was safe in her own home. By the time we returned home that afternoon, Emily was exhausted, her energy sapped by the adrenaline and fear of the morning. She rested on the couch while I paced the living room, replaying the confrontation in my mind. Every detail seemed more infuriating the more I thought about it. Mrs. Hargrove's rigid stance, her irrational escalation, the absurdity of attacking someone over a sticker. Neighbors who had witnessed the incident began to approach, offering apologies, support, and condolences. Some brought flowers. Others offered to help with errands, knowing that Emily would need to rest for the next few days. These gestures were small, but they reminded me that not everyone in our neighborhood condoned the violence. Amid the fear and anger, there were still allies, still people who recognized that what happened was unacceptable. Yet, despite the support, the shadow of Mrs. Hargrove's actions lingered. Every knock at the door, every movement outside our window, felt slightly tense. We both knew that she would continue to patrol the neighborhood, and while the police report had been filed, there was no guarantee that the confrontation wouldn't escalate again. The sense of security we once took for granted had been shattered, replaced with a cautious vigilance that neither of us welcomed. That evening, Emily and I sat together on the porch, the sun sinking low and casting long, soft shadows across the lawn. The neighborhood was quiet again, but the quiet felt different, strained, fragile. Emily rested her head against my shoulder, her small hand on my chest. "Do you think it will ever feel safe again?" she asked softly. I didn't have an answer. The morning had proven how quickly things could spiral, how unpredictably danger could arrive, even in a place where we had always felt secure. But I could promise her one thing: that we would face this together. That we would protect her and our baby, and that we would not let fear dictate our lives. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, I felt a mix of determination and dread. The events of the morning were only the beginning. There would be legal battles, difficult conversations, and the lingering tension of living in the shadow of someone who believed rules were more important than human decency. And yet, amidst it all, there was a stubborn spark of hope. That with careful planning, courage, and the support of our community, we could reclaim our sense of safety and peace. But for now, all we could do was heal, physically, emotionally, and mentally, and brace ourselves for what was undoubtedly going to be a long, complicated struggle against the woman who had turned our quiet neighborhood morning into a nightmare. The morning after the incident felt eerily quiet. Emily was still recovering from the shock, resting in bed while I brewed coffee and tried to organize my thoughts. But peace was elusive. The events of the previous day were now impossible to ignore. The confrontation with Mrs. Hargrove had left its mark, not just physically on Emily, but emotionally on both of us, and socially on the entire neighborhood. I started by contacting the HOA directly. The board members had a reputation for rigid adherence to their rules, but I hoped that reason would prevail, if only briefly, against the overzealous aggression of one individual. I drafted an email laying out the facts: the assault, Emily's injuries, the unnecessary escalation over a sticker, and the need for accountability. I attached photos of Emily's injuries in the mailbox as evidence. My hands trembled slightly as I hit send, knowing this was only the first step in a long, complicated process. Almost immediately, I received a reply from the HOA president, a man named Richard Gaines, whose tone was polite but measured. "We are reviewing the situation and will respond appropriately. All homeowners are expected to comply with our regulations, but violent behavior is not acceptable. We will investigate and determine the next steps." I read the message multiple times, trying to decipher whether it was a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing or just formal corporate speak designed to deflect responsibility. Emily watched from the bedroom doorway, her hand resting lightly on her stomach. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" she asked softly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we have to document everything and make sure this is on record. If the board doesn't act, we have legal options." Legal options. The words sounded heavy, almost ominous. They were also necessary. I had spent the rest of the morning reaching out to a lawyer friend who specialized in personal injury and civil disputes. She assured me that Emily's case was solid. Assault, physical injury, emotional trauma, and pregnancy complications all strengthened our position. The lawyer also mentioned potential HOA liability if it was proven that the organization had ignored repeated complaints about Mrs. Hargrove's aggressive behavior. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself had begun to take sides. Some residents were outraged, posting on community forums and social media, demanding that the HOA take swift action against Mrs. Hargrove. Others, often the ones who had long relied on her rule enforcement, argued that Emily should have followed proper protocol before placing the sticker. I read the comments with a mix of disbelief and frustration. How had a trivial HOA sticker become the source of such polarizing opinions? It became clear that Mrs. Hargrove was unrepentant. The day after the incident, she was spotted patrolling the streets, clipboard in hand, inspecting mailboxes and lawns as if nothing had happened. Her presence was intimidating, and several neighbors who had initially stayed neutral began avoiding contact, unsure where their loyalty, or fear, should lie. I realized that this situation wasn't just about one violent act. It had opened a wider fissure in the community, one that threatened the peace and civility we had taken for granted. Emily, however, was slowly regaining her strength. She remained cautious, but her resilience was remarkable. "I don't want her to scare me out of my own home," she said one afternoon, her voice quiet but determined. "We have to stand our ground." I nodded, knowing that she was right, but standing our ground would mean confronting not only Mrs. Hargrove, but also the legal and bureaucratic systems that could either protect us or drag the conflict out endlessly. 2 days later, we were summoned for a formal HOA meeting. It was meant to be a routine session, but given the circumstances, it had taken on a tense, almost adversarial tone. We arrived early, Emily seated beside me, visibly anxious yet composed. The board members sat at a long table in the community center, their expressions polite but unreadable. Mrs. Hargrove was already there, sitting rigidly at the end of the table, her arms crossed, eyes cold. Richard Gaines called the meeting to order, and I presented our case calmly and systematically. I described the incident, showed photographs, and referenced Emily's medical documentation. I emphasized that the confrontation had escalated unnecessarily and that her actions had endangered a pregnant woman, a fact that could not be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding. Mrs. Hargrove responded immediately. "I did nothing wrong," she said firmly. "I was enforcing the rules. It's not my fault she didn't comply. Everyone knows the procedures." Her voice was loud enough to carry across the room, and I noticed a few board members exchanging uneasy glances. Richard Gaines raised a hand, trying to restore order. "Mrs. Hargrove, please. We understand your perspective, but physical aggression is not permissible. This board takes such complaints seriously." I pressed further, emphasizing the emotional trauma Emily had endured. "It's not just the physical injury," I said. "The fear, the stress, the worry for the baby, it's ongoing. This behavior can't be ignored or normalized." The discussion became heated. Some board members nodded sympathetically, while others muttered about rules and enforcement responsibilities. Mrs. Hargrove remained defiant, insisting that she had acted in the neighborhood's best interests. Her words were chilling in their detachment. It was as if the idea of harming someone, pregnant or otherwise, was inconceivable to her because she had convinced herself she was above reproach. By the end of the meeting, the board promised to conduct a full investigation. While this was a small victory, I knew that bureaucratic processes could drag on for weeks or months, during which time the tension in the neighborhood would continue to simmer. In the following days, the psychological toll became apparent. Emily experienced nightmares and anxiety, fearing another encounter with Mrs. Hargrove. Even simple walks to the mailbox became stressful, and I found myself accompanying her every step of the way. Our home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground, a space where we had to be vigilant to ensure safety. At the same time, I began gathering evidence to support a potential lawsuit. Emails, witness statements, social media posts, and photographs were all organized meticulously. Every interaction with Mrs. Hargrove or the HOA board was documented, knowing that credibility would be crucial if the case proceeded to court. Our lawyer also suggested we keep a detailed journal of Emily's physical and emotional condition, a timeline that could demonstrate the ongoing impact of the assault. Neighborhood dynamics were shifting rapidly. Friends who had once casually waved in the morning now crossed the street to avoid any encounter with us or Mrs. Hargrove. Rumors spread quickly, with some claiming Emily had exaggerated the incident, while others openly condemned Mrs. Hargrove's actions. It was exhausting, watching the social fabric of our community unravel, revealing undercurrents of fear, judgment, and divided loyalties. Despite the turmoil, Emily and I made a conscious effort to focus on her recovery and the baby's well-being. We took long walks together, always cautious, always alert, but finding moments of calm wherever possible. Friends and family provided emotional support, helping us maintain a semblance of normalcy. Each day, Emily's resilience grew, her determination to not let fear control her life evident in the way she carried herself, even after the trauma. And yet, the shadow of Mrs. Hargrove loomed over everything. Every HOA meeting, every neighborhood interaction, reminded us that this conflict was far from over. Her refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, her steadfast belief in her own authority, and her aggressive enforcement of trivial rules ensured that our struggle for justice, and for peace, was only beginning. By the end of the week, it was clear that this was more than an HOA dispute. It was a confrontation between human decency and rigid authoritarianism, between empathy and obsession, between fear and courage. And while the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, one thing was certain. Emily and I would face it together, armed with the truth, legal documentation, and an unshakable determination to protect our family. The morning sunlight that once promised serenity now carried a different meaning. It was a reminder of vigilance, resilience, and the complex realities of suburban life where rules, civility, and human decency sometimes collided in the most unexpected and violent ways. The weeks that followed the HOA meeting were tense and exhausting. The investigation promised by the board seemed to move at a glacial pace, with emails, phone calls, and occasional meetings that added stress without immediate results. Emily and I spent our days in cautious vigilance, avoiding unnecessary interactions, documenting every detail, and preparing for the possibility that the board might try to dismiss the incident. Mrs. Hargrove, predictably, remained defiant. She continued her patrols, often standing at her porch or walking the streets with her clipboard, scrutinizing neighbors' homes and vehicles. Each sighting made Emily flinch and me clench my jaw. It was as if she were daring us, a constant reminder that the situation wasn't over. Meanwhile, the legal aspect of the case progressed more quickly than I had anticipated. Our lawyer filed a formal complaint of assault and battery, citing Emily's injuries, her pregnancy, and the emotional trauma she had endured. Witness statements and photographic evidence strengthened our case, and the initial consultations with the HOA's legal team revealed that Mrs. Hargrove's actions could not simply be swept under the rug. The first major breakthrough came during a pre-trial hearing. The HOA's counsel attempted to argue that Mrs. Hargrove acted within her scope of authority as a volunteer enforcement officer, but the presiding judge was skeptical. The court was clear. No HOA rule justified physical aggression, and a pregnant woman's safety was paramount. It was a moment of validation for us, a recognition that what had happened was not merely a neighborly dispute, but a serious assault. Emotionally, the pressure was immense. Emily oscillated between relief that legal action was moving forward and anxiety about further conflict. Some days, she would cry quietly, the memories of the shove, the fall, and the fear of harm overwhelming her. Other days, she would steel herself, determined not to let Mrs. Hargrove control our lives or instill fear. I stayed by her side constantly, offering reassurance, protection, and the promise that we would endure this together. Neighborhood dynamics continued to shift during this period. The community was divided. Some neighbors remained loyal to Mrs. Hargrove, insisting that her intentions had been noble, while others rallied behind us, offering support and sometimes even acting as informal witnesses during interactions. Social media posts and private messages flowed in, some encouraging, some accusatory. It became clear that the incident had permanently altered the social fabric of the neighborhood. People had been forced to choose sides, revealing the subtle tensions that had always existed beneath the surface. Then came the day of the mediated settlement. The HOA and Mrs. Hargrove were represented by their attorneys, and Emily and I sat across the table, bracing ourselves for confrontation. The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Hargrove's posture was as rigid as ever, her lips pressed tightly together, but I could sense a flicker of unease. Perhaps recognition that the legal system might not bend in her favor. Our lawyer opened the discussion, presenting a clear and measured account of the events, the injuries, and the emotional trauma. Photographs and medical documentation were shared. Witness statements were read aloud. The case was compelling. It was difficult, if not impossible, to argue that Mrs. Hargrove had acted reasonably or justifiably. Mrs. Hargrove's attorney attempted a defense, arguing that the incident was unintentional, and that Emily had provoked the situation by allegedly violating HOA protocol. But the evidence was stacked against her. Videos from neighbors, photographs of the scene, and Emily's medical reports painted a starkly different picture. She had been aggressive, confrontational, and physically violent without cause. After hours of tense negotiation, the HOA offered a formal apology to Emily and me, acknowledging that the actions of one member had violated basic standards of safety and decency. The HOA agreed to implement new protocols to prevent similar incidents, including stricter oversight of volunteer enforcement officers and mandatory training on conflict resolution and de-escalation. Mrs. Hargrove, faced with mounting evidence and the possibility of personal liability, reluctantly signed the settlement. She remained outwardly defiant, but the legal acknowledgement of wrongdoing was undeniable. For Emily and me, it was a mixture of relief and residual anger, a recognition that justice had been served, even if it did not erase the trauma entirely. In the weeks following the settlement, we focused on healing. Emily's physical injuries healed quickly, but the emotional scars lingered longer. Counseling sessions helped us process the fear, anxiety, and shock of the incident. Slowly, we regained our confidence in stepping outside, going for walks, and interacting with neighbors without constant fear. The community, too, began to shift. While Mrs. Hargrove remained in the neighborhood, her influence waned significantly. Many neighbors expressed support, offering reassurance and acknowledgement of our ordeal. Through the experience, Emily and I discovered new depths of resilience and solidarity. We learned that standing up for oneself and one's family often meant navigating uncomfortable legal and social terrain, confronting injustice head-on, and maintaining composure amid chaos. The ordeal, though painful, strengthened our bond, our empathy for each other, and our determination to protect our child. Months later, as Emily approached her due date, the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm. The HOA was more cautious in enforcing rules, and Mrs. Hargrove's behavior, while still sharp, no longer carried the same unchecked authority. Our home felt like a sanctuary again, a place where safety and peace could gradually be restored. When our child was born, healthy and vigorous, the sense of triumph was profound. Holding our baby in the quiet of our living room, Emily's hand resting gently on my arm, we reflected on the journey we had endured. The morning that had begun with a simple task, a sticker on a mailbox, had escalated into a battle for justice, safety, and human decency. We had faced fear, aggression, and the rigidity of a system that sometimes prioritizes rules over people, and we had emerged stronger for it. While the memory of that morning never fully faded, it became a touchstone for resilience rather than trauma. We shared our story with close friends, and later with neighbors, emphasizing the importance of standing up for what is right, protecting the vulnerable, and refusing to allow fear or intimidation to dictate one's life. In the end, the lesson was clear: rules and regulations are only meaningful when tempered with humanity. Without compassion, oversight, and accountability, they can be weaponized, causing harm rather than promoting order. And while Mrs. Hargrove's actions had shaken us, they also revealed the power of persistence, solidarity, and the courage to pursue justice, no matter how trivial the initial trigger might seem. Our neighborhood remained the same in outward appearance: tidy lawns, clean sidewalks, and familiar streets. But beneath the surface, there had been a shift. Awareness, accountability, and compassion now carried more weight than rigid enforcement. And for Emily, our child, and me, that was the most important change of all. The morning that had once brought chaos and fear now symbolized endurance, courage, and the ultimate triumph of decency over aggression. And as we stepped outside, our baby in arms, sunlight spilling over the lawn, I realized that, despite everything, we had reclaimed not only our safety but our peace, and a lesson in humanity that would stay with us forever.